After signing divorced papers, her billionaire husband, Thomas Sterling, had prepared with help from 3 lawyers and a prenuptial expert, Amanda found herself locked out in the snow on the coldest December night in 15 years, while Thomas prepared to marry his mistress Rachel in a dawn ceremony already arranged with a celebrity officiant. The snow fell so thick it erased visibility beyond 5 feet, turning the world into a white void where Amanda stood shivering in the cocktail dress she'd worn to what she'd believed was a reconciliation dinner, her 7-month pregnant belly the only warmth in a landscape of ice as she watched her husband's shadow move through lit windows, celebrating her absence with the woman who'd replace her. But Thomas was celebrating a delusion, toasting a victory that didn't exist, because the dependent housewife he was divorcing was actually a secret trillionaire real estate mogul, whose property empire spanned 12 countries and included the office buildings where his hedge fund operated, the luxury apartments his clients purchased as investments, and the commercial developments that generated the revenue streams he analyzed in quarterly reports, without ever realizing he was analyzing her success, not his market insights. Amanda had inherited her first property at 16 from a reclusive uncle, had spent her college years learning real estate law and international investment strategies, and had built her empire behind a maze of corporate structures so complex that forensic accountants would need months to trace them. Months that Thomas, in his arrogance, had never bothered to invest because he'd decided on their second date that she was sweet but simple, someone who needed his sophistication and financial guidance to navigate the world. His sister Patricia had reinforced this narrative for 7 years, treating Amanda like an accessory rather than a person, often making comments about how Amanda should be grateful for the lifestyle Thomas provided, how she should work harder to maintain her appearance for a man as successful as Thomas, and how the family worried that Amanda wasn't intellectually stimulating enough for someone of Thomas's caliber. The contempt crystallized at the Thanksgiving party when Patricia, performing for an audience of Thomas's business associates and their spouses, mocked Amanda's pregnancy weight, suggested the baby was probably an accident Amanda engineered to lock down Thomas's wealth, and physically blocked Amanda from the buffet table while commenting that some people need to think about portion control if they want to keep their husbands interested. What Amanda did in response didn't involve tears or arguments. It involved the cold activation of power that had been dormant for 7 years, waiting for the moment when revelation would serve justice better than continued concealment. The companies Thomas's hedge fund invested in operated from her buildings. The banks that financed his deals answered to boards where her representatives held decisive votes. The media outlets that praised his financial acumen were owned by parent companies that were ultimately owned by subsidiaries that were ultimately owned by her. When she decided to act, Thomas's billion-dollar reputation didn't collapse. It evaporated, revealed as a carefully maintained fiction that existed only because she'd chosen not to contradict it, a choice she revoked with devastating efficiency that left him permanently homeless, not through dramatic bankruptcy but through the systematic withdrawal of support systems he'd never realized he was dependent on because they'd always been there like oxygen, invisible until they disappeared. But why did Amanda choose to spend 7 years married to a man while hiding her true identity and wealth? What devastating truth about Rachel did Amanda discover that made Thomas's choice to marry his mistress the most catastrophic decision of his life? And how does a woman transition from shivering in the snow while pregnant to orchestrating the permanent homelessness of a billionaire without ever speaking to him directly? This story teaches you the ultimate price of treating people as less than, the reality that your success might be built on foundations you don't control, and how sustained disrespect creates moral debts that compound with interest until payment destroys you. The narrative delivers essential lessons about the danger of assumptions, the importance of recognizing that intelligence and power come in forms you might not expect, and how public cruelty toward vulnerable people will eventually be answered with public destruction. You'll benefit from understanding that the person you're dismissing might be the person who controls your fate. That restraint is a choice powerful people make until circumstances demand otherwise, and that locking a pregnant woman out in the snow isn't just morally reprehensible, it's strategically suicidal when that woman possesses the power to erase your entire existence. You'll learn about respect, humility, the importance of treating everyone with dignity, and the profound truth that what you do to others will eventually be done to you, often with interest, often at the moment when you're most vulnerable, and always with the precision of justice that has been patiently waiting for its moment to arrive. The Uber driver who picked Amanda up from the country club that Thanksgiving night would later tell police he'd never seen someone so calm with wine staining their entire dress, but Amanda had learned composure from her Uncle Gerald, the reclusive real estate genius who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 14. Gerald had owned properties in 43 states by the time cancer took him 2 years later, but he'd been invisible to the business world, operating through such dense corporate layering that Forbes never knew his name, despite his wealth exceeding most people on their lists. He'd taught Amanda that power whispered while weakness shouted, that true control meant never letting anyone see the strings you were pulling, and that the moment someone underestimated you was the moment you'd already won because they'd stopped watching for your next move. She'd inherited everything at 16, not just properties, but the entire philosophy, the complete system of trusts and LLCs and offshore holdings that made her wealth essentially invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it, with sophisticated forensic tools and unlimited time. Thomas had possessed neither the tools nor the inclination, too busy admiring his own reflection in the financial press to notice that the woman making him coffee every morning owned the building where Bloomberg's offices were located, along with the parking garage where his Bentley sat and the exclusive restaurant where he'd proposed to her 7 years ago on a rooftop that belonged to a holding company that belonged to another holding company that eventually, if you followed the chain far enough, belonged to her. The moment Thomas had slid those divorce papers across the table at what Amanda thought was their anniversary dinner, she'd felt something shift inside her, not heartbreak, because she'd stopped loving him somewhere around year 4 when he'd forgotten her birthday for the 3rd consecutive time while remembering to send his secretary an expensive gift, but rather a kind of clarity, the way fog lifts and suddenly you can see the landscape you've been walking through has been a battlefield all along. She'd signed the papers without argument, her hand steady despite being 7 months pregnant, because arguing would have revealed that she cared about the prenuptial agreement he thought was protecting his wealth, and she needed him to believe his victory was complete, so he wouldn't see what was coming. The security guards who'd escorted her out had been professionals from a firm that, coincidentally, operated from a building in a complex owned by one of her subsidiary companies, but they didn't know that, and neither did Thomas, and Amanda had simply walked to the street and called for a ride, while her husband celebrated inside with Rachel, the mistress who'd been sending him explicit messages for 18 months. Using a phone Amanda had been monitoring since week 2 of the affair. Rachel was a fascinating case study in human ambition meeting human stupidity, a former pharmaceutical sales representative who decided that seducing wealthy men was more profitable than selling them medication, and who'd successfully convinced Thomas that she loved him for his mind rather than his money, despite her browser history showing searches for Thomas Sterling net worth and how to protect assets in marriage, dating back to their 3rd date. Amanda had discovered Rachel's existence the old-fashioned way. Thomas had been sloppy with his phone password, using their wedding anniversary despite having forgotten the actual anniversary itself. But she'd investigated Rachel's background using considerably more sophisticated methods. private investigators who worked for firms that, 3 corporate layers down, were employed by companies Amanda controlled, had provided her with Rachel's complete history. 4 previous relationships with wealthy men, 2 ended with settlements after Rachel threatened to go public with private information. 1 ended with a restraining order that Rachel had managed to get sealed, and 1 that simply disappeared from records in a way that suggested money had changed hands to make problems go away. Thomas, in his arrogance, hadn't bothered to do any of this research because he'd been thinking with parts of his anatomy that didn't include his brain, and because Patricia had been so enthusiastic about Rachel, calling her vibrant and exciting compared to Amanda's boring presence at family dinners, that he'd taken his sister's endorsement as validation, rather than recognizing it as Patricia's continued campaign to erase Amanda from their family portrait. Patricia had never liked Amanda from their first meeting at Thomas's parents' estate in the Hamptons, where Amanda had arrived in a simple dress from a department store while Patricia wore designer everything and made sure everyone knew it. Patricia had decided within 5 minutes that Amanda was beneath their family, that Thomas was slumming by dating someone without obvious wealth or pedigree, and that the relationship would end once Thomas came to his senses and found someone from their own social class who understood the obligations and expectations of marrying a Sterling. The Thanksgiving party where Patricia had humiliated her had been held at Patricia's estate in Connecticut, a sprawling property Patricia loved to show off, despite the fact that, and this was a detail Amanda found deeply amusing, the land was technically owned by a conservation trust that leased it to a holding company that subleased it to Patricia's husband's family corporation, and Amanda had acquired controlling interest in that conservation trust 3 years ago as part of a larger portfolio purchase. Patricia didn't know she was essentially a tenant in her own home, paying lease fees that ultimately flowed through various corporate channels back to Amanda. And Amanda had never bothered to mention this because watching Patricia act superior while being unaware of her actual position in the power structure was its own form of entertainment. But the entertainment had stopped being amusing when Patricia had gathered an audience of 50 people in the main parlor and staged her theatrical humiliation, starting with comments about Amanda's pregnancy glow that were clearly coded insults about weight gain, then progressing to jokes about how some people used pregnancy to trap wealthy men because they couldn't compete on their own merits, and finally culminating in the buffet incident where Patricia had physically blocked Amanda from the food table while suggesting that portion control might help Amanda keep her husband, even though everyone in the room knew Thomas had already filed for divorce. The wine Patricia had poured on Amanda's dress had been a 1982 Chateau Margaux, worth roughly $4,000 per bottle, and Patricia had made a show of accidentally spilling the entire thing on Amanda's white maternity dress while apologizing in a tone that made it clear the accident was intentional and the apology was performance. The room had laughed, not everyone, but enough people that the sound had echoed off the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers, and Amanda had stood there with wine dripping from her hair and dress, her pregnant belly an obvious target Patricia had deliberately aimed for, and she'd smiled and excused herself and walked out without saying a single word because words at that moment would have been wasted on people who'd already decided she deserved their contempt. The Uber had taken her to a hotel, the Waldorf Astoria, because Amanda appreciated irony and she owned that building too, where she'd showered and changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the bed with her laptop and begun making phone calls to people who'd been waiting for years to receive them, calls that would set in motion events Thomas couldn't possibly anticipate, because he'd never bothered to learn who his wife actually was. Beneath the surface, he'd decided to find her completely. The first call Amanda made was to Leonard Chen, the managing director of Blackstone Real Estate Holdings, a man who'd been her silent partner in 17 major acquisitions over the past decade, and who owed his current position to a recommendation Amanda had made to the board during a restructuring that would have otherwise eliminated his entire division. Leonard answered on the second ring despite the late hour, his voice shifting from casual to focused the moment he heard her tone, because in all their years of working together, Amanda had only used this particular tone 3 times, and each time had preceded moves that reshaped entire markets in ways analysts were still trying to understand. She didn't explain the personal context, didn't mention the wine-soaked dress currently hanging in the hotel bathroom or the divorce papers sitting in her purse, just gave him a list of properties and the names of shell corporations that nominally owned them, and asked him to begin the process of reviewing lease agreements and tenant contracts with particular attention to renewal clauses and termination conditions. Leonard was smart enough to understand what wasn't being said, professional enough not to ask questions that didn't concern him, and loyal enough to begin sending preliminary reports within 2 hours, documents that confirmed what Amanda already knew, but needed officially verified before she could proceed to the next phase. The properties in question included the office complex where Sterling Capital Management, Thomas's hedge fund, had operated for the past 8 years, occupying the entire 14th floor of a building in Manhattan's financial district that Thomas believed he leased from a company called Meridian Holdings, LLC, never knowing that Meridian was owned by a Cayman Islands trust that was controlled by a Delaware corporation that ultimately answered to Amanda, through layers so complex that even the IRS would need months to trace them completely. The second call went to Margaret Rothstein, the attorney who'd handled all of Amanda's legal structures since she'd turned 18 and who'd been Gerald's lawyer before that, a woman in her 60s who'd built her career representing clients who valued invisibility over publicity and who understood that the most powerful legal work happened in documents no one ever saw, rather than in courtrooms everyone watched. Margaret had drafted every LLC formation, every trust agreement, every corporate filing that comprised Amanda's empire, and she'd done it with the precision of someone who understood that in the world of high-level finance, paper trails were both necessary for legitimacy and dangerous for privacy, requiring careful construction to satisfy regulators while revealing nothing to competitors or enemies. Amanda explained what she needed: a comprehensive review of every business relationship Thomas Sterling had, every loan agreement his fund had signed, every vendor contract his company relied upon, every media relationship that supported his reputation, and Margaret understood immediately that this was about dismantling rather than building, about finding pressure points rather than avoiding them. Margaret's voice had carried a note of something that might have been satisfaction or might have been simple professional interest when she'd said she'd have preliminary findings within 48 hours, and Amanda had known from that tone that Margaret had never particularly liked the way Thomas had treated her during the few times they'd met, when he'd been dismissively polite in the way wealthy men often were toward service providers they considered beneath their attention, not realizing that Margaret controlled legal structures worth more than most countries' GDP and could destroy careers with strategic document amendments if she were ever motivated to do so. The third call was the most personal, placed to Jessica Wu, her best friend from college and the only person outside her professional circle who knew the full extent of Amanda's wealth, the only person Amanda had trusted with the truth during those years when keeping secrets from everyone, including her husband, had sometimes felt like wearing a mask so long it was becoming her actual face. Jessica had been furious when Amanda called her from the hotel, not at Amanda but at Thomas and Patricia and everyone who'd participated in that humiliation, her voice rising to levels that made Amanda pull the phone away from her ear, while Jessica cycled through increasingly creative descriptions of what Thomas deserved and what Patricia should experience. But Jessica's anger, unlike Patricia's cruelty, came from love rather than contempt, from 7 years of watching Amanda subjugate herself to a man who didn't deserve her patience. And when Jessica finally calmed down enough to listen, she'd asked the question Amanda had been waiting for, "So what are you going to do about it?" Amanda's answer had been simple and complete. Everything. Jessica had gone quiet for a moment, understanding the weight behind that single word, knowing Amanda well enough to recognize that when she committed to action it was total and irreversible. And then Jessica had said she'd be on the first flight from San Francisco in the morning because whatever Amanda needed, however this unfolded, she wasn't going to face it alone, even though both of them knew Amanda was perfectly capable of executing her plans without support. But that friendship meant showing up anyway. The 4th through 7th calls went to board members of various companies, conversations carefully structured, to never explicitly state what was happening, but to plant seeds that would grow into exactly the conclusions Amanda needed them to reach independently. Corporate governance was a fascinating dance of suggestion and inference, where direct orders were less effective than carefully framed questions that led intelligent people to believe they'd reached important conclusions through their own analysis rather than external pressure. Amanda asked about market conditions and regulatory environments, about strategic reviews of vendor relationships, and efficiency analyses of current operational structures, about whether it might be prudent to reconsider certain partnerships, given changing market dynamics. And each person she spoke with understood, without Amanda having to say it directly, that changes were coming and that positioning themselves correctly now would be remembered favorably when the dust settled. She never mentioned Thomas by name, never referenced Sterling Capital Management specifically, just spoke in the abstract language of business strategy that everyone in these positions understood could mean anything or nothing depending on what actually happened next, creating plausible deniability for everyone involved while ensuring they'd make the decisions she needed them to make when the moment came. By 3 in the morning, Amanda had made 14 calls total, sent 37 emails, and reviewed 62 pages of contracts and agreements that Margaret's team had already begun compiling, working at speeds that reflected both their professional competence and their understanding that this project carried unusual priority. She'd ordered room service at midnight, a club sandwich and sparkling water, because the baby needed nutrition even if Amanda's appetite had disappeared somewhere around the moment Patricia had poured wine on her, and she'd eaten mechanically while reading financial statements and corporate filings, her mind organizing the information into structures and patterns that revealed the architecture of Thomas's professional life in ways he'd never seen himself because he'd been too close to it, too embedded in his own narrative of self-made success to recognize how much of his foundation rested on infrastructure he didn't control. The irony was almost beautiful. Thomas had spent their entire marriage lecturing Amanda about financial literacy and investment strategy, explaining concepts to her with the patient condescension of someone teaching a child basic arithmetic, never realizing she understood those concepts better than he did because she'd been implementing them at scale since before they'd met. She'd sat through countless dinners where he'd explained market dynamics and portfolio theory, nodding and asking simple questions that made him feel intelligent and needed, questions she'd carefully calibrated to reinforce his belief in her intellectual dependence while actually probing to understand exactly how he thought about risk and opportunity so she'd know precisely where his blind spots were. The memory that kept surfacing as Amanda worked through those early morning hours was from their second date, the dinner where Thomas had decided she was sweet but simple, a conclusion he'd reached because Amanda had deliberately presented herself that way, playing a role she'd learned from Gerald, who'd always said the best camouflage was meeting people's expectations so completely they stopped looking deeper. She'd worn a dress from Target, had suggested they eat at a mid-range Italian restaurant instead of the expensive steakhouse Thomas had proposed, had talked about her administrative job at a nonprofit with enthusiasm that wasn't entirely faked, because she did find genuine satisfaction in that work, never mentioning that she also sat on the nonprofit's board under a different name, or that the building housing their offices belonged to her through 3 corporate layers. Thomas had interpreted her modesty as limitation rather than strategy, had concluded that her simple presentation reflected simple thoughts rather than sophisticated concealment, and had decided that night that he would be her guide into his world of wealth and sophistication, never imagining that she was already operating in stratospheres above his reach while deliberately flying below his radar. That fundamental misunderstanding had defined their entire relationship, with Thomas constantly explaining and Amanda constantly learning what he revealed about himself through his condescension, information that proved more valuable than anything he actually thought he was teaching her. The dawn ceremony where Thomas married Rachel happened at exactly 6:15 in the morning, officiated by a celebrity pastor who specialized in performing weddings for wealthy people who wanted spiritual legitimacy without spiritual inconvenience. Someone who asked minimal questions and provided maximum theatrical value for the premium fees he charged. Amanda knew the exact timing because she'd been monitoring Thomas's calendar through the shared cloud account he'd never bothered to remove her from, an oversight that revealed how little he'd actually thought through the logistics of divorcing someone he'd been married to for 7 years, assuming that signing papers and changing locks was sufficient to sever all connections, without realizing that modern life created digital threads that persisted long after physical separation. She'd watched from her hotel room as social media posts began appearing from the guests Thomas had invited to witness his new beginning. Photographs of him and Rachel exchanging vows in the library of his, formerly their, home. Rachel wearing a white dress that cost more than most people's cars, and Thomas wearing the expression of someone who believed he'd successfully traded disappointment for excitement, loss for gain, obligation for passion. Patricia had posted extensively, her captions celebrating her brother's fresh start and his courage to pursue authentic happiness, language that framed abandoning a pregnant wife as personal growth rather than cruelty, that recast selfishness as self-actualization in the way people often did when they wanted to feel good about supporting morally questionable behavior. Amanda had felt nothing watching those posts appear except a kind of distant clinical interest, the way a scientist might observe bacteria growing in a petri dish, noting patterns and growth rates without emotional investment in the outcome because the outcome was already determined by variables the bacteria couldn't perceive or control. She'd closed her laptop at 6:30, having seen enough to confirm that Thomas's celebration was complete and his attention was entirely focused on his new marriage, meaning he wasn't watching for threats or monitoring his business interests with the vigilance he might have maintained if he'd suspected anything was wrong. This was the window she needed, the moment when his guard was completely down because he believed the battle was over and he'd won, not understanding that what he thought was the end was actually just the beginning of something he hadn't known to prepare for. She'd taken a shower, dressed in comfortable clothes suitable for a day of meetings, and ordered breakfast while reviewing the reports that had continued arriving throughout the night, from Margaret's team and Leonard's analysts, documents that painted a comprehensive picture of exactly how interconnected Thomas's success was with infrastructure he didn't own, relationships he didn't control, and goodwill he hadn't earned, but had simply borrowed from systems that had always been there, supporting him like invisible scaffolding. The meeting Amanda had scheduled for 8 o'clock that morning was with David Park, the CEO of Titanium Property Group, one of the largest commercial real estate management firms in North America, and a company that managed 17 of the buildings Amanda owned in Manhattan alone, including the one that housed Sterling Capital Management. David had been expecting a routine quarterly review when his assistant had confirmed the meeting, but his expression when Amanda walked into his office and closed the door behind her had shifted immediately to focused attention, because Amanda had never requested an in-person meeting before, having always conducted their business through digital communication and occasional phone calls that maintained the professional distance appropriate for a client-manager relationship that neither party needed to be closer than transactional. She'd gotten straight to the point, explaining that she needed to review the lease agreement for the Sterling Capital Management offices, with particular attention to early termination clauses, renewal options, and any provisions that might allow for expedited exit procedures under specific circumstances. David, to his credit, hadn't asked why, had simply pulled up the relevant contracts and walked through them section by section, his finger tracing lines of legal language that confirmed what Amanda had suspected. The lease Thomas had signed 3 years ago contained a provision allowing for termination with 30 days' notice if the building ownership changed hands, or if the tenant's business underwent significant restructuring that might affect their ability to meet financial obligations. Standard language Thomas's lawyers had agreed to because they'd never imagined either circumstance would occur. Amanda had asked David to prepare formal notice of lease review based on anticipated ownership restructuring, language deliberately vague enough to be legally defensible while specific enough to trigger the relevant clauses, and David had nodded and made notes and promised to have the documents ready by end of business that day, his professionalism preventing him from asking the questions his expression suggested he was thinking. She'd thanked him and moved to her next meeting, this one with Robert Chen, who managed the parking facility, where Thomas kept his Bentley and who'd been surprised to receive Amanda's call requesting a breakfast meeting, but who'd agreed because clients who owned entire parking structures rather than just individual spaces generally received immediate accommodation regardless of how unusual their requests might seem. Robert had been even more surprised when Amanda explained that she needed to review the terms under which premium parking spaces were allocated to long-term contract holders, specifically whether those contracts included provisions that allowed for termination if the contract holders' payment methods changed or if their corporate standing shifted in ways that affected creditworthiness. Robert had confirmed that yes, such provisions existed, and that the parking facility maintained the right to reassess contracts annually or whenever significant changes in a client's financial situation warranted review, standard practice in an industry where expensive cars and expensive parking often attracted people whose financial situations were more fragile than their luxury purchases suggested. The pattern continued through 7 more meetings that day, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that Amanda was assembling with the precision of someone who'd spent years studying exactly how Thomas's professional life was constructed and where its vulnerabilities were hidden. She met with the manager of the exclusive restaurant where Thomas entertained clients, learning that their private dining room memberships could be revoked if members engaged in behavior that reflected poorly on the establishment's reputation, a clause broad enough to encompass almost anything the restaurant's owners wanted it to mean. She met with the executive at the luxury car dealership where Thomas had financed his Bentley, discovering that the financing agreement included accelerated payment provisions if the borrower's income or employment status changed significantly, protecting the dealership against clients whose apparent wealth turned out to be borrowed rather than owned. She met with the director of the country club, where Thomas played golf and hosted business functions, confirming that membership was contingent upon maintaining good standing in the community and that the club's board retained discretion to revoke memberships if members became associated with scandal or controversy that might affect the club's reputation, language designed to protect against members who might attract negative publicity that could damage the club's exclusive brand. Each meeting lasted between 20 and 45 minutes, each one professional and focused on seemingly routine administrative questions that only revealed their true purpose when viewed collectively as part of a coordinated strategy, and none of the people Amanda met with fully understood what they were contributing to because Amanda had been careful to frame her questions as general inquiries about policies and procedures rather than specific investigations into particular individuals. This was Gerald's wisdom manifesting through her actions. Never reveal your full hand. Never explain more than absolutely necessary. Never let anyone see the complete picture, because the moment they understood what you were building, they might choose to warn the target or distance themselves from potential controversy. But if they only saw their individual piece, they'd cooperate fully because cooperation seemed routine and unremarkable. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Amanda had met with 14 different people who controlled 14 different aspects of Thomas's daily life and professional infrastructure, and each one had confirmed that the systems Thomas relied upon without thinking about them, the office space, the parking, the dining memberships, the club access, the car financing, the vendor relationships, all contained provisions that could be activated under circumstances that Amanda was now positioned to create. The final meeting of that day was back at the hotel with Jessica, who'd arrived on a noon flight and had spent the afternoon coordinating with Amanda's assistant to compile additional research on Rachel's background, information that went considerably deeper than what the private investigators had initially provided because Jessica had access to databases and networks that existed specifically for situations where standard investigation tools weren't sufficient. What Jessica had discovered was both predictable and shocking. Rachel wasn't just a serial seducer of wealthy men. She was currently under investigation by the FBI for securities fraud related to her previous relationship with a hedge fund manager in Boston, a case that had been quietly proceeding through grand jury proceedings without public disclosure because prosecutors were still building their evidence and didn't want to alert other potential conspirators. Rachel had apparently convinced her previous boyfriend to share insider information about upcoming mergers and acquisitions, had traded on that information through accounts held in her mother's name, and had made approximately $7 million before the SEC had noticed the suspicious trading patterns and alerted federal prosecutors. The investigation had been ongoing for 8 months, meaning it had started before Rachel had even met Thomas, suggesting that her relationship with him might have been partially motivated by needing to establish connections with someone in finance who could potentially help her if the investigation became public, or simply by wanting to secure a new wealthy partner before her legal troubles made her toxic in the circles where she'd been operating. Amanda had listened to Jessica's report with that same clinical detachment she'd maintained throughout the day, absorbing information without emotional reaction, because emotions at this stage would be counterproductive to clear thinking, and what the situation required was absolute clarity about what was true versus what was convenient to believe. Thomas had married a woman who was under federal investigation for securities fraud, had brought her into his home and his life and his business networks without apparently doing any meaningful background research, and had done all of this while divorcing his pregnant wife and locking her out in the snow, a sequence of decisions so catastrophically stupid that Amanda almost felt embarrassed for him, except that embarrassment required caring what happened to him, and she'd moved past caring into the territory of simple consequence implementation. The question wasn't whether Thomas deserved what was coming, he absolutely did, but rather how to ensure that what was coming was comprehensive enough that he couldn't rebuild using the same patterns of arrogance and cruelty that had made this moment inevitable, and that required destroying not just his current position, but his ability to ever occupy similar positions again, which meant attacking not just his wealth, but his reputation, not just his business, but his credibility, not just his present, but his future. The Thanksgiving confrontation that had started everything had happened on a Thursday, and by the following Tuesday morning, Thomas Sterling's world had begun collapsing in ways he didn't yet recognize because the initial tremors were small enough to dismiss as coincidental inconveniences rather than coordinated assault. The first sign appeared at 9:15 when his assistant Maria knocked on his office door with an expression that mixed confusion with concern, holding a letter that had arrived by courier from Meridian Holdings, LLC, informing Sterling Capital Management that due to anticipated ownership restructuring of the property, their lease agreement was being placed under review per Section 14.7 of the Standard Commercial Tenancy Contract, and that a representative would be contacting them within 30 days to discuss renewal terms or transition arrangements. Thomas had barely glanced at the letter before tossing it toward his desk and telling Maria to have their real estate attorney handle it, assuming this was routine administrative nonsense that lawyers existed to manage, while he focused on actual important matters like the merger deal he was negotiating for a client that would net his firm a 7-figure advisory fee. He'd spent the previous 3 days honeymooning with Rachel at a resort in St. Bart's, posting photos of sunset dinners and beach walks that had generated hundreds of likes from followers who either didn't know about his divorce or didn't care because social media rewarded beautiful images, regardless of the ethics behind them. And he'd returned to work that morning feeling refreshed and validated in his decision to prioritize his own happiness over the obligations of a marriage that had stopped satisfying him years ago when Amanda had become more focused on her pregnancy than on maintaining her appearance and being the kind of wife who enhanced rather than diminished his social standing. The second sign came at 11:30 when the country club where Thomas maintained his membership called to inform him that his account was being flagged for administrative review due to recent changes in his personal circumstances, and that while his membership remained active during the review period, his charging privileges had been temporarily suspended until the review was completed, which they anticipated would take approximately 30 to 45 days depending on the board's meeting schedule. Thomas had been annoyed rather than alarmed, had called the club manager directly and demanded to know what changes in personal circumstances meant, and had been told in professionally vague language that the club simply needed to verify that all members continued to meet the standing requirements outlined in the membership bylaws, particularly regarding community reputation and financial stability. Thomas had pointed out that his financial situation was excellent and his reputation was impeccable, that he'd just successfully closed a major deal and had been featured in a Forbes article about rising stars in hedge fund management. But the club manager had remained politely immovable, explaining that the review was standard procedure and would be completed as quickly as possible, but that club policy prevented any exceptions to the temporary suspension of privileges during active reviews. Thomas had hung up frustrated but not yet suspicious, categorizing this as bureaucratic inefficiency rather than intentional targeting, never imagining that the club's board had received an anonymous tip that morning suggesting they might want to review the membership status of someone who was potentially associated with individuals under federal investigation, language carefully constructed to raise alarm without making specific accusations that could be legally challenged. The third and fourth signs arrived almost simultaneously, just after lunch, when Thomas's car dealership called to inform him that his Bentley financing was being reviewed for potential early payment requirements due to modifications in his employment classification that might affect income stability projections. And when his assistant informed him that the private dining room he'd reserved for a client dinner that evening at his favorite restaurant had been canceled with apologies but no explanation beyond scheduling conflicts, despite the reservation having been confirmed just 2 days earlier. Thomas had started to feel the first stirrings of something beyond annoyance at this point, a sense that these apparently unrelated incidents might actually be connected in ways he didn't understand. But he dismissed the feeling as paranoia, because who would be coordinating action against him? And why would they bother with such petty disruptions when anyone who actually wanted to hurt him would target his business directly, rather than irritating him with administrative inconveniences? He'd spent 20 minutes arguing with the dealership's finance manager about the absurdity of reviewing a loan for someone whose income had increased, not decreased, pointing out that his recent deal had actually improved his financial position substantially. But the finance manager had remained firm that the review was required by their lending policies and would proceed regardless of Thomas's objections, and that in the meantime his monthly payment was being increased by 40% as a precautionary measure until the review confirmed his continued creditworthiness. Patricia had called at 3 o'clock, her voice tight with an emotion Thomas initially couldn't identify, until he realized it was fear, explaining that she'd received a letter from something called the Greenfield Conservation Trust informing her that the lease terms for her Connecticut estate were being modified to reflect updated market valuations and that her annual lease payment would be increasing by 300% starting next quarter. Thomas had been confused because Patricia had always told everyone she owned her estate outright, had inherited it from their mother's side of the family, and Patricia had admitted in a voice that mixed embarrassment with panic that the property was actually held in trust with her family corporation as lessee, an arrangement that had seemed advantageous years ago for tax purposes, but that now appeared to be a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. Thomas had told her to have her lawyers handle it, that conservation trusts couldn't just arbitrarily triple lease payments without justification, but Patricia had already consulted her lawyers, and they'd informed her that the trust absolutely could adjust terms based on market valuations as long as they provided 90 days' notice, which the letter did, and that fighting it would likely cost more in legal fees than just paying the increase or relocating to a different property. Patricia had asked Thomas if he thought this could be connected to Amanda somehow, if Amanda might have connections to the Conservation Trust, and Thomas had laughed, genuinely amused by the suggestion because Amanda had no connections to anything sophisticated or powerful, was just a simple woman who'd been good at pretending to be content with a life she'd never been qualified to inhabit, and the idea that she could coordinate business actions of this complexity was absurd enough to dismiss without consideration. But by 5 o'clock, when Thomas's primary bank called to inform him that his business line of credit was being reviewed for potential restructuring due to concerns about his firm's operational stability, and when his largest client called to say they'd received a concerning inquiry from an investment research firm asking questions about Sterling Capital Management's compliance procedures and regulatory history, Thomas had moved past dismissal into the first stages of genuine alarm. He'd demanded to know what investment research firm and what specific questions, but his client had been vague, saying only that the inquiry had come through channels that suggested serious institutional interest rather than casual curiosity, and that while he personally had complete confidence in Thomas's integrity, his own board was requiring him to conduct additional due diligence before proceeding with the new investment mandate they'd been about to award Sterling Capital Management. Thomas had spent the next 2 hours making phone calls trying to determine what was happening, who was asking questions about his firm and why, but every conversation had led to dead ends or vague references to routine reviews and standard procedures that explained nothing while confirming that something unusual was definitely occurring across multiple aspects of his business simultaneously. Rachel had noticed his agitation over dinner that evening, had asked what was wrong with that expression of concern that never quite reached her eyes, and Thomas had explained that he was dealing with some unusual business complications that were probably nothing but that were monopolizing his attention in ways that made him less present than he wanted to be during their first week of marriage. Rachel had been sympathetic in the performative way She was sympathetic about everything, saying the right words in the right tone while clearly thinking about something else. And Thomas had felt a flash of irritation that he'd suppressed because he'd just left one wife who didn't understand him, and he needed his new wife to be everything Amanda hadn't been, even if that meant overlooking signs that Rachel's interest in his problems was considerably less genuine than her interest in the lifestyle his wealth provided. They'd gone to bed early, Rachel claiming exhaustion from the travel and adjustment to married life, and Thomas had laid awake scrolling through emails and trying to find patterns in what was happening, some explanation that made sense of why multiple unrelated entities had suddenly decided to review or modify their relationships with him in the same week, unless they weren't unrelated at all but were somehow connected through networks he didn't understand, responding to influences he couldn't identify. The nightmare that woke Thomas at 3 a.m. was about Amanda standing in snow that fell upward instead of down, her pregnant belly glowing with some internal light while buildings crumbled around them both, and he'd sat up gasping with the certainty that whatever was happening was connected to her somehow, even though rationally that made no sense because Amanda had no power or influence or capacity to affect his business relationships. But the feeling persisted through the sleepless hours until dawn, a growing conviction that he'd missed something fundamental about his ex-wife, that the 7 years they'd spent married had been built on assumptions he'd never bothered to verify, because verification would have required considering that she might be something other than what he'd decided she was. He'd gotten out of bed at 5:30, had gone to his office while Rachel slept, and had begun searching for information about Amanda that went beyond the surface he'd always been satisfied with, typing her name into search engines and databases with increasing desperation as the results returned nothing significant. No business registrations or property records or corporate affiliations that would explain how she could be coordinating what appeared to be a systematic assault on every aspect of his professional infrastructure. The absence of information was somehow more disturbing than negative information would have been, suggesting either that Amanda was genuinely as powerless as he'd always believed, or that she was operating at levels of sophistication that left no obvious traces for casual investigation to discover, and Thomas had found himself hoping for the first explanation, while increasingly suspecting the second might be true. By the time Maria arrived at 8 o'clock that Wednesday morning, Thomas had dark circles under his eyes and a list of 14 questions he needed answers to, questions about shell corporations and property trusts and conservation organizations and investment research firms, questions that would require professional investigators and forensic accountants to answer properly, but that Thomas needed preliminary information about immediately because the feeling that his world was being deliberately dismantled had transformed from paranoid suspicion into operational certainty. He'd tasked Maria with hiring the best investigation firm in New York, cost irrelevant, speed essential, and Maria had made the calls while Thomas attended a meeting with his own lawyers to discuss the lease review and the credit line restructuring and the country club suspension and all the other seemingly unrelated incidents that had accumulated in just 3 business days. His lawyers had been professionally reassuring, explaining that these things happened sometimes in cycles of administrative review that could seem coordinated but were usually just coincidental, that Thomas's financial position was strong and his reputation was solid, and that all of these matters would likely resolve in his favor once the various reviewing entities completed their processes and confirmed what Thomas's lawyers already knew about his creditworthiness and character. Thomas had wanted to believe them, but couldn't shake the conviction that coincidence didn't explain the precision of the timing or the breadth of the coordination, that someone somewhere was pulling strings he couldn't see attached to systems he'd taken for granted, and that whoever was doing this understood his vulnerabilities better than he understood them himself, because they'd identified pressure points he hadn't known existed until pressure was applied to them. The investigation firm Thomas hired delivered their preliminary report on Friday morning, 72 hours after he'd commissioned the research, and the lead investigator, David Morrison, had requested an in-person meeting to discuss findings rather than simply emailing the report, which Thomas's experience told him meant the news was either very bad or very complicated, or both. David had arrived at Thomas's office at 9 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 47 pages of documentation, and he'd begun by asking Thomas how much he actually knew about his ex-wife's background before they'd married, a question that had seemed irrelevant until David started walking through what his team had discovered. Amanda hadn't been a struggling administrator at a nonprofit when Thomas met her. She'd been a board member operating under her middle name, while simultaneously managing a real estate portfolio that David's team had traced through 6 corporate layers before losing the thread in a maze of offshore structures that would require months and international cooperation to fully unravel. The properties David's team had been able to definitively connect to Amanda included the building where Sterling Capital Management's offices were located, the parking structure Thomas used daily, the restaurant where he'd proposed to her 7 years ago, and approximately 60 other commercial and residential properties in Manhattan alone, with preliminary evidence suggesting her holdings extended to at least 11 other countries and possibly more that hadn't been discovered yet. Thomas had felt the room tilt slightly as David continued explaining, his voice professionally neutral, while describing how Amanda's wealth wasn't measured in millions but in billions, possibly trillions based on the scale of properties they'd identified and the market values associated with them, and how she'd apparently been operating this empire since her late teens through corporate structures so sophisticated that David's team, which included former FBI forensic accountants, had never seen anything comparable outside of sovereign wealth funds and intelligence agency operations. David had also discovered that the Greenfield Conservation Trust, that was tripling Patricia's lease payments, was controlled by a board that included 3 people who'd attended college with Amanda, that the country club reviewing Thomas's membership had recently received a major donation from a foundation whose trustees included Amanda's best friend, Jessica Wu, and that the investment research firm asking questions about Sterling Capital Management was actually a subsidiary of a due diligence company that was owned by a holding company that David's team suspected but couldn't yet prove was connected to Amanda's network of corporate entities. The pattern was unmistakable. Every inconvenience Thomas had experienced over the past week could be traced back through various corporate channels to organizations that had some connection to Amanda, either directly through her ownership or indirectly through her associates and allies, suggesting a level of coordination that required not just wealth but also strategic patience and detailed knowledge of Thomas's vulnerabilities. But the truly devastating information in David's report wasn't about Amanda at all. It was about Rachel, whose background David's team had investigated as part of their comprehensive review of Thomas's situation. Rachel Morrison, not Rachel Sterling yet, since she'd apparently decided to keep her maiden name for professional reasons Thomas hadn't questioned, was currently under federal investigation for securities fraud related to insider trading schemes she'd allegedly orchestrated with her previous boyfriend in Boston, a hedge fund manager named Gregory Walsh, who'd committed suicide 6 months ago when the investigation had intensified, and who'd left behind evidence suggesting Rachel had been the primary architect of the trading strategy that had netted them $7 million in illegal profits. The investigation had been proceeding quietly through grand jury proceedings that were expected to result in indictments within the next 60 to 90 days, meaning Thomas had married someone who would likely be facing federal criminal charges before their first anniversary, someone whose legal problems would inevitably contaminate his own reputation and business relationships once they became public knowledge. David had provided Thomas with sealed court documents his team had obtained through sources Thomas didn't want to know about. Documents showing that Rachel had been cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for leniency, providing information about other traders and potentially setting up new targets, including anyone she might have recent access to who worked in finance and might make useful prosecution witnesses or defendants. Thomas had asked in a voice that didn't sound like his own whether David thought Rachel had married him specifically to gain access to information she could trade to prosecutors, and David had said diplomatically that he couldn't speculate about motivations, but that the timing of their relationship, beginning just weeks after Gregory Walsh's suicide, had intensified Rachel's legal jeopardy, was certainly noteworthy, and that Thomas should probably consult with criminal defense attorneys immediately to ensure he wasn't inadvertently exposing himself to legal liability through any conversations or business dealings Rachel might have access to. Thomas had felt something cold settle in his chest, a realization that spread through his body like ice water, that he'd been comprehensively played by everyone in his life, that Amanda had been hiding vast wealth while Rachel had been hiding federal investigations, that his sister Patricia had been living in a property she didn't actually own while lecturing Amanda about knowing her place, and that his entire understanding of power and status and who mattered in the world had been constructed on foundations that were now revealed as completely fictional. He'd dismissed David with instructions to continue investigating and to keep everything confidential, but confidentiality was already compromised because David's questions had themselves created ripples in networks where information flowed quickly among people who made their livings knowing things before others did. By Monday morning, the ripples had become waves. Thomas's largest client had formally withdrawn their investment mandate, citing concerns about Sterling Capital Management's operational stability and regulatory exposure, taking with them 40% of the assets Thomas's firm managed and triggering contractual provisions that allowed two other major clients to reduce their allocations immediately, without penalty. His bank had converted his business line of credit review into an actual credit line termination, demanding immediate repayment of the outstanding balance within 30 days, and citing material changes in his business outlook that violated the terms under which credit had been extended. The country club had completed their administrative review with remarkable speed and had voted to suspend his membership indefinitely pending resolution of concerns about his association with individuals under federal investigation, language carefully constructed to avoid specific accusations while making clear they wanted distance from whatever scandal was coming. The parking facility had terminated his premium space contract and had his Bentley towed to public storage, and the car dealership had accelerated his entire loan balance, demanding immediate payment of $270,000 within 15 days, or they would repossess the vehicle and pursue him for any deficiency remaining after resale. Patricia had called crying, explaining that her lawyers had advised her the Conservation Trust's lease modification was completely legal and that fighting it would be futile, that she'd have to either pay the increased amount or vacate the property within 90 days, and that her husband was furious because he'd specifically asked before they'd moved in whether the property was actually owned or just leased, and Patricia had assured him it was owned because she'd never bothered to verify the trust arrangement she'd inherited. Thomas's own lawyers had informed him that the lease review for his office space had concluded with Meridian Holdings deciding not to renew, giving Sterling Capital Management 30 days to vacate the premises, per the termination clauses Thomas's previous attorneys had agreed to without apparently reading carefully. His professional liability insurance carrier had sent notice that they were reviewing his coverage for potential non-renewal based on elevated risk factors, including client complaints and regulatory inquiries that Thomas knew nothing about, but that apparently existed in databases insurance companies monitored. The Forbes reporter who'd written the flattering profile about Thomas just 2 months earlier had called asking for comment on rumors that Sterling Capital Management was experiencing financial difficulties and client defections, rumors that were becoming self-fulfilling prophecies as each new article or social media post about Thomas's troubles prompted more clients to reconsider their relationships with his firm. Rachel had moved out on Tuesday, leaving a note explaining that she needed space to deal with personal matters and that she'd be staying with friends while she figured out her next steps. Language that Thomas understood meant she was abandoning ship before it sank completely and taking whatever intelligence she'd gathered about his business operations to use in plea negotiations with federal prosecutors who'd be very interested in any evidence of additional securities violations they could add to their case. Thomas had tried calling her 17 times that day, had left increasingly desperate messages asking her to explain what was happening and what she'd told investigators and whether she'd ever actually loved him or if their entire relationship had been a strategy to gain access to someone in finance she could potentially implicate in illegal activity. But Rachel hadn't answered, and eventually her phone had been disconnected, suggesting she'd gotten a new number specifically to avoid his calls. Patricia had stopped speaking to him after he'd suggested that maybe her treatment of Amanda had contributed to their current situation, that publicly humiliating a woman who apparently controlled vast wealth and business networks had been strategically stupid regardless of whether it was morally wrong, and Patricia had screamed that this was somehow his fault for marrying someone so far beneath their family that she'd needed to resort to financial terrorism to feel important. Logic that made no sense, but that Patricia needed to believe to avoid examining her own role in creating the disaster, consuming them both. By Thursday of the second week, Thomas had lost his office, his country club membership, his car, his professional liability insurance, 60% of his client assets, and his wife, the new one who'd lasted exactly 19 days before abandoning him, not the previous one he'd locked out in the snow, who'd apparently been orchestrating his destruction from a distance without ever speaking to him directly or making any public statements about what he'd done to her. His remaining clients were withdrawing their funds systematically as news spread through professional networks that Sterling Capital Management was imploding, and the employees he'd hired were updating their resumes and taking calls from competitors who were happy to poach talent from a firm that was clearly collapsing. His accountant had informed him that without the income from his hedge fund, Thomas's personal financial situation was actually precarious despite his apparent wealth, that most of his net worth was tied up in illiquid investments and partnership stakes that couldn't be easily converted to cash, and that the combination of his accelerated car loan, his legal fees, and his need to find new office space immediately was going to exhaust his liquid reserves within 60 to 90 days, unless he could stabilize his client base, which seemed increasingly unlikely as each day brought new defections and new rumors about regulatory investigations that didn't actually exist, but that people believed existed because enough other people were acting as if they existed. The final piece fell on Friday when Thomas received notice that his apartment lease, the home he'd shared with Amanda and was now sharing with no one since Rachel had fled, was being terminated because the building's owners had decided to convert the property to condominiums, and all existing tenants would need to vacate within 60 days, a conversion that Thomas's real estate attorney told him was almost certainly fictional because condo conversions required extensive regulatory approval and years of planning, not sudden announcements with 60-day timelines. But the lease termination was legally valid, regardless of the stated reasoning, because Thomas had signed a lease that allowed termination for property renovation, with 60 days notice, standard language he'd never paid attention to, because he'd never imagined it would be deployed against him, and his attorney confirmed that fighting it would be expensive and ultimately futile, because the property owners had legal authority to terminate under the contract terms Thomas had agreed to. Thomas had asked who owned the building, had demanded his attorney investigate the corporate structure, and the answer that came back 2 days later was that the building was owned by a Delaware LLC that was controlled by a Cayman Islands trust that was managed by a Swiss bank that represented beneficiaries whose identities were protected by multiple layers of privacy protection that would require court orders and international cooperation to penetrate, but that based on circumstantial evidence and the timing of the termination notice, Thomas's attorney suspected the ultimate owner was probably Amanda or someone acting on her behalf. The evening Thomas received that confirmation was the evening he finally understood the full scope of what had happened. Sitting in an apartment he'd have to vacate in 58 days with nowhere to go because his credit had been destroyed by the cascade of financial reviews and terminations. His professional reputation was ruined by rumors of regulatory investigations and client complaints. His marriage to Rachel had exposed him to potential criminal liability as a witness or worse in her securities fraud case, and his ability to rebuild any aspect of his life had been systematically eliminated by someone who'd spent 7 years married to him while hiding power he'd never suspected she possessed. He'd locked Amanda out in the snow while she was 7 months pregnant, had divorced her to marry a woman who was under federal investigation, had allowed his sister to publicly humiliate her at a Thanksgiving party where wine was poured on her dress and insults were delivered to an audience of 200 people. And Amanda had responded not with tears or anger or legal action, but with the methodical dismantling of every structure his life was built upon, executed through corporate channels and business relationships he'd never known she controlled, orchestrated without her ever speaking to him directly, or making any public accusations, or doing anything that could be clearly identified as revenge, because technically all she'd done was exercise her legal rights as a property owner and investor to review leases and modify business relationships in ways that happened to destroy him completely. Thomas had spent 3 months sleeping in his car after the apartment eviction, then another 2 months in a homeless shelter after he'd been forced to surrender the car to satisfy the loan deficiency, his hedge fund having been dissolved when his last remaining clients withdrew their funds and his employees departed for stable employment elsewhere. His professional licenses had been suspended, pending investigation into client complaints that Thomas suspected Amanda had somehow generated through proxies, and his attempts to find work in finance had been blocked by the reputation damage that preceded him everywhere he applied. Patricia had lost her Connecticut estate and had stopped speaking to their entire family, blaming Thomas for the disaster, despite having been the one who'd physically assaulted Amanda at the Thanksgiving party that started everything. Rachel had been indicted on 17 counts of securities fraud and was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Thomas had been questioned twice by FBI agents who seemed very interested in his relationship with her and whether he'd been aware of her illegal activities, questions he'd answered truthfully, but that had generated legal fees he couldn't afford and additional reputation damage he couldn't repair. He'd seen Amanda once during those months, glimpsed her getting out of a black SUV in Midtown, wearing an elegant coat that probably cost more than Thomas currently owned, her pregnancy now in its final weeks, and she'd looked directly at him standing on the corner with a cardboard sign asking for help, had held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds with an expression that contained neither triumph nor pity, but simply acknowledgement that he existed and that she'd seen him, and that this was the consequence of locking someone out in the snow, and then she'd turned and walked into a building that Thomas realized with sick certainty she probably owned, leaving him standing in the cold understanding finally and completely that the person he'd dismissed as simple and dependent had been the most powerful force in his life all along, and that his failure to recognize that truth until she'd decided to reveal it had cost him absolutely everything.